Everyone, this is Abolfazl Sharifian. I hope wherever you are healthy and safe. So the topics that we are going to talk about is dynamics of pastoral traditional ecological knowledge. In this presentation, we will find out how many studies do we have on pastoral traditional knowledge, how geographically these studies are distributed, and on which knowledge domain these studies are conducted. We will also see if these studies are reporting any transition in pastoral traditional knowledge and whether this reported transition is erosion, adaptation, hybridization, or retention. Through this presentation, we highlight that studies on pastoral traditional knowledge comprise only 3% of all studies on traditional knowledge of all societies. Also, pastoral traditional knowledge transition is reported mostly as erosion, and erosion is not the only transition type, and adaptation and hybridization are also the possible transition types. Prior to proceed with this presentation, it would be better to have some definitions. Traditional ecological knowledge systems are cumulative bodies of knowledge, practices, and beliefs of indigenous people and local communities evolving by adaptive processes and handed down through generations by cultural transmission. In this study, we focus on pastoral livelihoods that aim at raising domesticated and semi-domesticated livestock with nature. This entails the movement of people and herds across landscape, making use of natural vegetation and crop byproducts. Pastoralism is about animals walking to their feet instead of having it grown, caught, and brought to them. In pastoral systems, animals are grazed and foraged in an extensive system instead of being stall-fed in an intensive system. Before I mentioned that in this study, we track the transition in pastoral knowledge in 4 categories of retention, erosion, adaptation, and hybridization. In this study, retention is defined as the continuity and persistence of traditional knowledge without significant change in its quality and quantity. Erosion is the decline or loss of traditional knowledge. Adaptation is the transformation of traditional knowledge to adjust to changes in environment and conditions. And hybridization is integration of traditional knowledge to another knowledge systems. So, how we conducted our systematic review? First, we looked for all available peer-reviewed papers on pastoral traditional knowledge using Web of Science. We found 382 papers. We screened these 382 papers and removed papers not related to pastoral traditional knowledge. We ended up having 288 papers. For these 288 papers, we recorded the countries where the studies were conducted. Then we subsampled 152 papers for a more quantitative review. In these 152 papers, we recorded the type of pastoral systems as nomadism, transhumance, and sedentarism. We also recorded the studied knowledge domain in 5 categories of herd livestock, forage medicinal plants, landscape wildlife, climate, and social cultural. We looked if the study reported any transition in knowledge as yes or no. Then we recorded the type of transition as erosion, retention, hybridization, or adaptation. We also recorded the drivers of knowledge erosion, which was mentioned in the papers. Finally, we looked for the number of studies available on all traditional ecological knowledge of all societies, including hunter-gatherers, farmers, fishermen, etc. So what our results showed. On the left axis of this line chart, you see the number of studies on pastoral traditional knowledge, and on the right axis, you see the number of studies on traditional knowledge of all societies. We see an increasing trend in the number of studies of both groups, which is a good thing. However, when you compare the numbers, you see that number of studies on pastoral traditional knowledge comprise only 3% of all studies on traditional knowledge. So, considering the fact that more than 40% of terrestrial lands are used by pastoralists and the estimates of hundreds of millions of pastoralists, this question arises that, is this number of studies enough? When we look at the spatial distribution of studies on traditional knowledge of pastoralism, we see a higher number of studies in East African countries such as Ethiopia and Kenya, and some Asian countries like India and China. This is while studies in South and North America are quite rare. Also in countries with high population of pastoralists such as Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and some countries in Central Africa, we found few studies, or in some cases we found no study. So as I mentioned before, we recorded the reported transition in pastoral knowledge as retention, erosion, adaptation, and hybridization. Before talking about the recorded transition, let's see some examples of each transition type to make it clear what do we mean by each of these states. Regarding retention, a study in Ghana and Burkina Faso compared the forage knowledge between young and old generation, and they found no difference between them. So this is an example of the continuity and persistence of knowledge. With regard to erosion, a study in northern Kenya compared the plant knowledge between two groups of herders' children, one actively engaged in pastoral activities and the other actively engaged in formal schooling. They found children engaged in formal schooling with significantly less knowledge compared to the other group. This study was an example for the erosion of the knowledge. Regarding adaptation, a study in Benin showed because of the encroachment of farmland and less rangeland availability, full-bay cattle herders were changing their breeds with high milk and meat production to cattle breeds more tolerant to hunger. As a consequence, they were losing their knowledge about previous breeds and gaining more knowledge about the new cattle breeds. With respect to hybridization, a study in Uganda showed that because of being exposed to modern weather prediction techniques and information, pastoralist knowledge in Rwenzori region currently is a hybrid knowledge based both on scientific and traditional knowledge. So now that we explained these examples for each of these knowledge transition states, let's see the result of our study. From all 152 papers that we reviewed, 41% of all of them reported at least one type of transition. If we consider these 41% as a whole, 83% of these studies reported erosion of the knowledge. As you can see, 5, 6, and 6% of the studies also reported retention, adaptation, and hybridization of knowledge. On the bar chart, you can see that higher number of studies report erosion of knowledge in the last 6 to 7 years. In this global map, in which the red circle are showing the erosion of the knowledge, you can see that erosion of knowledge is commonplace globally, and it is highly reported in countries such as Ethiopia, India, and Kenya, and China. We also have some examples of adaptation, hybridization, and retention of knowledge that you can see here. In this slide, in the bar chart, the red numbers are showing the number of studies for each knowledge domain. As you see, in the last 3 decades, scientists have focused more on domains such as herd livestock, forage, medicinal plants, landscape, wildlife, and paid less attention to climate and social cultural domains. Of course, 15 studies on climate change is helpful, but considering the fact that global warming is increasing the vulnerability of pastoralists, is this number of studies enough? We can see that at least 31% of the studies in each knowledge domain are reporting erosion of the knowledge. If you look at the pie chart, you can also see the reported transition knowledge for all pastoral systems such as nomadism, transhumance, and sedentarism. And you can see that in all 3 pastoral system types, erosion was the most often reported transition. Well, we found many studies reporting erosion of the knowledge among all the studies. In some studies, the drivers of knowledge erosion was mentioned. We found 13 drivers from which social cultural changes and formal schooling was repeatedly mentioned as the main drivers of knowledge erosion. Regarding social cultural changes, for instance, it was mentioned that being a herder or shepherd is not as prestigious as it used to be before. They were mentioning that new generation are not proud to be engaged in pastoral activities. Also, collapse of customary institutions and local governance was another way in which social cultural changes resulted in knowledge erosion. Formal schooling was frequently mentioned to result in knowledge erosion mostly in two ways. First, children going to schools and not being engaged in pastoral activities, or the second one, pastoral families abandoning pastoral lifestyle because of their children. So what was the main messages of this study? We report that only 3% of studies on traditional ecological knowledge address pastoral traditional ecological knowledge, thus voicing important research gap. Our study also identifies where those gaps are, thus contributing to preparation for the largely endorsed proposal of the International Year of Rangeland and Pastoralism for 2026. Despite the fact that pastoralists carry knowledge in several domains, the limited research on pastoral traditional knowledge has focused more often on domains such as herd livestock, forage medicinal plants, and landscape wildlife, and paid less attention to climate and social cultural domains. Our study showed that knowledge erosion might be the most dominant type of knowledge transition occurring among pastoralists worldwide. Another key result of our study was that knowledge adaptation and hybridization were shown to be critical in the implementation of solutions to new social ecological challenges in many areas of the world. So scientists should not pay mostly attention to erosion of the knowledge, and they should consider adaptation and hybridization of the knowledge as well. We argue that research on pastoral traditional knowledge could help to advance policy around pastoralism, for instance, by highlighting the ways in which pastoralism contributes to planetary sustainability and the context that facilitates or undermines such contributions. So the paper from this study is accepted for publication in the Journal of Ecology and Society. In case anyone is interested, you might be able to find the papers in the next 2 months. We wish to thank IUBS, Center for Ecological Research, and Gorgon University of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources for financially supporting this study. Thank you all of you for paying attention to this presentation.